The unexpected encounter. Johnny Depp was familiar with the hustle and bustle of downtown, where towering glass monoliths scraped the sky and the city thrummed with energy. It was the typical urban symphony, a constant blend of honking horns, the murmur of conversations, and the distant clatter of construction. Despite the noise, Johnny had always found a sense of calm amidst the chaos, his eclectic style standing in stark contrast to the polished suits of the business people rushing around him. On this particular morning, he had just stepped out of a luxury hotel, sunglasses perched on his nose, making his way to the awaiting limousine, where his chauffeur, Thomas, stood at attention. "Good morning, Mr. Depp," Thomas greeted, his voice calm but respectful. Johnny returned the greeting with a nod and a warm smile. "Morning, Thomas. It's been a good stay, but I'm looking forward to heading home. There's one more stop for a photo shoot, but after that, I'll be free for a while." As he reached the sleek black vehicle, Johnny was just about to slip inside when something unexpected happened. A small, fragile figure darted past him, moving with surprising speed for her size. Before he could react, he felt a tiny hand latch onto his leg, and looking down, he saw a little girl clinging to him desperately. Her eyes were wide with fear, her body trembling, and her once dark hair was completely bald. Caught off guard, Johnny gently placed a hand on her trembling shoulder. "Hey there," he said softly, trying to catch her eye. "Are you all right?" Before the girl could respond, a shout pierced the air. "Get off of him, you little brat." Johnny glanced up to see a red-faced man in his 40s, wearing a convenience store apron, marching towards them with a look of disdain. His eyes were fixed on the direction the girl had run, unaware of the celebrity he was approaching. The girl's grip on Johnny's leg tightened for a moment before she abruptly let go and ran, disappearing into the crowd of pedestrians. The man reached Johnny, still ranting, his face twisted in anger. "She's always hanging around my store, scaring away customers," the man complained. "Brings nothing but bad luck. She's always touching everything, looking around but never buying. It's unsettling. I swear she's just waiting for me to drop my guard so she can steal something." Johnny's brow furrowed as he listened. "Has she ever actually taken anything? Or broken something?" he asked, his voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of challenge. The store owner paused, clearly caught off guard by the question. "Well, no," he admitted, "but she's always there. Always. It's just not right." Johnny considered this for a moment before replying, his voice steady but firm. "You know, I've learned in my life that it's not wise to judge people for crimes they haven't committed. Maybe there's more to her story than meets the eye." With that, Johnny turned and climbed into the waiting limousine, the door closing behind him. He looked out the window as the limousine pulled away from the curb, still thinking about the little girl's fearful eyes and the strange encounter. His thoughts were interrupted when Thomas spoke, his voice smooth and professional. "Everything all right, sir?" Johnny turned to look at his chauffeur. "I'm not sure," he replied, his voice thoughtful. "There's something about that girl. Something's not right. Can we drive a little slower today? I want to keep an eye out for something." Thomas, ever attentive, nodded. "Of course, Mr. Depp. I'll adjust the speed." As the limousine eased through the busy city streets, Johnny's eyes scanned the sidewalks, searching for any sign of the little girl. His heart felt heavy as he thought about her trembling form, and the terror in her eyes. He couldn't shake the feeling that she was in danger, that something was wrong, and that he needed to do something. "Thomas, slow down here," Johnny instructed after a few moments of tense silence. He saw a familiar figure sitting on the curb outside a convenience store further up the street. There, amidst the sea of people, he recognized the girl. "Pull over, please," Johnny said, his voice now urgent. Thomas obeyed without question, the car coming to a smooth stop. Johnny stepped out onto the sidewalk, his signature sunglasses still in place, and approached the girl slowly, not wanting to startle her. She sat with a small paper cup extended in front of her, begging for donations. Her posture was slumped, exhausted, and resigned. But when Johnny drew near, her eyes lit up with recognition. Johnny crouched down in front of her, offering him a gentle smile. "Hello again," he said softly, his voice kind. He reached into his wallet and pulled out several large bills, placing them in her cup. The girl's eyes widened at the unexpected generosity. Without a word, she lunged forward, wrapping her arms around his leg in an embrace. "Thank you," she mumbled, her voice muffled against the fabric of his pants. Then, pulling away slightly, she looked up at him with wide eyes filled with wonder. "Are you Captain Jack Sparrow?" she asked, her voice filled with innocence. Johnny's heart warmed at the girl's enthusiasm, despite the sadness of her situation. He couldn't help but chuckle, slipping into his Captain Jack Sparrow persona. "I love," he said, his voice taking on a playful tone. "The Black Pearl is anchored safely in a secret cove, waiting for its next adventure. But tell me, what's a brave little pirate like you doing out here all alone?" The girl's smile faltered, her eyes dropping to the ground. She glanced nervously around before returning her gaze to Johnny. "Please help me," she whispered, her voice trembling with fear. "I need your help." Before Johnny could respond, the scene quickly shifted. A small crowd began to gather around them, people recognizing Johnny and approaching with their phones in hand, eager to take pictures and ask for autographs. The girl flinched, shrinking back from the attention, overwhelmed by the sudden intrusion into her already vulnerable state. Johnny instinctively took a step back, his calm demeanor barely faltering. He moved toward the limousine, and Thomas, ever vigilant, stepped in swiftly. "All right, folks," Thomas said, his voice firm yet polite. "Give Mr. Depp some space." His imposing presence was enough to guide Johnny back toward the car, and Johnny slid into the back seat, looking back through the window as the crowd closed in on the girl. As the limousine pulled away, Johnny's thoughts remained with the girl. He had seen something in her eyes, a plea for help that he couldn't ignore. The crowd, the busy street, the photos, none of it mattered. He had made a promise to her in that moment, and he intended to keep it. "I'll be back," he whispered under his breath, the words carrying a quiet promise to the little girl. A promise made. The limousine glided through the streets of the city, its tinted windows shielding Johnny Depp from the prying eyes of fans and passersby. Despite the luxury of the vehicle and the anticipation of his photo shoot, his mind wasn't on the upcoming session or his career. It was on the little girl he had just encountered. Her bald head, her trembling voice, the desperate plea for help. Johnny couldn't shake the image of her eyes, wide, afraid, and filled with something he couldn't quite place, but knew needed attention. The vehicle slowed as they approached the next intersection. Johnny turned to Thomas, who had been driving in silence, perhaps sensing the shift in his boss's mood. "Thomas," Johnny began, his voice serious, "I know we have a schedule to keep, but I need you to take me back to where we saw the girl." Thomas glanced at him through the rearview mirror. He could see the resolve in Johnny's eyes, the silent determination that often accompanied his more impulsive decisions. "Of course, Mr. Depp," Thomas replied without hesitation. "I'll make sure we don't lose any time. We'll get you back on track after." Johnny nodded, but his mind remained firmly on the girl. As the limousine took a slow U-turn and retraced their route through the city, he couldn't stop thinking about what he had seen. The girl's name, Sonia, hadn't come up in their brief interaction, but her vulnerability had spoken volumes. And the more he thought about it, the more Johnny was certain that there was something far deeper to her story than just homelessness or begging. The city passed by in a blur of towering buildings, bustling pedestrians, and endless traffic. The usual sights that Johnny had long grown accustomed to seemed distant now, fading into the background of his thoughts as his attention remained fixated on the girl. He recalled the moment when she had wrapped her arms around his leg, that desperate, genuine grasp of someone in need. The memory tugged at him in ways he couldn't fully articulate. But there was one thing Johnny knew for sure. She wasn't just begging for change. She was begging for help. His fingers drummed against the leather seat as the limousine cruised back toward the convenience store. As they neared the location, Johnny's chest tightened. He couldn't explain it, but the urgency inside him was growing. What had happened to her? What could have led a little girl to wander the streets alone, seemingly abandoned, with such fear in her eyes? Finally, the limousine slowed as it neared the block. Johnny's heart raced in his chest as he looked out the window, his eyes scanning the crowd for any sign of the small, bald figure. There were no signs of her at first, just the usual mix of pedestrians moving about their business, a few cars parked along the street, and the hum of the city. "Stop here," Johnny instructed, his voice almost pleading. Thomas brought the car to a halt by the curb, and Johnny was out of the door in an instant. His boots hit the sidewalk with a soft thud as he walked briskly toward the store where he had first seen Sonia. His eyes were focused, scanning each face, each corner, his chest tightening with each passing second. But the scene that greeted him was far from what he expected. The street outside the store was quieter now. The bustling crowd thinned out. Johnny's gaze flicked to the door of the store, and he caught sight of a familiar figure slipping through the entrance. It was Sonia, but she wasn't walking in the carefree manner of someone who had just finished a normal errand. She was moving slowly, her shoulders hunched as if the weight of the world had settled on her small frame. And then something caught his eye. He saw her pause in front of the store window and glance back. Her expression was one of desperation and fear, but also exhaustion, as if she had been running for far too long. Johnny's steps quickened as he approached. When Sonia turned to walk past him, he took a deep breath, his voice soft yet firm. "Sonia." She froze. Her small body stiffened at the sound of her name, and then she slowly turned around to face him. For a brief moment, her eyes seemed to hold a flicker of hope. But just as quickly, that hope faded, and she looked down at the ground, avoiding his gaze. Johnny crouched down to her level, trying not to appear threatening. His gaze softened, his expression one of understanding. "Hey, it's okay. I'm not here to hurt you." The girl glanced up at him with a mixture of caution and uncertainty. She seemed torn, unsure of what to make of the man who had so unexpectedly entered her life. The world around her had been harsh, unkind, and she had learned long ago not to trust people easily, especially strangers. Johnny reached into his pocket and pulled out a few bills, holding them out to her with an open hand. "I know you're in need," he said quietly, "but what I want to know is why. Why are you out here? What's really going on?" Her eyes flickered to the money, but instead of reaching out for it, she shook her head, her face tightening with frustration. "I don't want your money," she muttered, her voice small but insistent. "I need something more than that." Johnny's heart clenched. This wasn't about charity. This wasn't about a handout. It was about survival, about a young girl fighting for her life. And something told him she wasn't asking for help from just anyone. She was asking for help from him. Sonia took a deep breath before finally looking Johnny in the eyes. "I'm sick," she whispered. "I need medicine, but I don't have enough money. No one will help me, and I've been trying to save up for months. But I'm running out of time." Her voice broke as she spoke, and Johnny felt the weight of her words settle in his chest. It wasn't just illness she was fighting. She was fighting against a world that had abandoned her, one that had turned its back when she needed it the most. Johnny stood up slowly, his thoughts racing. He glanced toward the convenience store again, the dark windows staring back at him with no answers. "Where are you staying, Sonia? Do you have a place to sleep?" The girl's face hardened, but her eyes betrayed her sadness. "I sleep in alleys," she replied simply. "Wherever I can find a place that's safe. It's better than nothing." Johnny felt a surge of anger rise within him, not toward Sonia, but toward the system that had failed her. He had seen enough in his life to know that there were so many like her, children discarded, forgotten, living in the shadows. His resolve solidified, and he made a decision in that moment. This wasn't just some chance encounter. This was a call to action, and Johnny wasn't the type to turn away from a call like that. Without another word, Johnny motioned for her to follow him. He turned toward the waiting limousine, his heart set on helping this young girl in whatever way he could. He couldn't change the world overnight, but he could start with Sonia. "Let's get you somewhere safe," Johnny said, his voice determined. "I promise we'll figure this out." As the limousine doors closed behind them and the car began to drive away, Johnny's thoughts raced. He had a lot to figure out: who was responsible for her care, how to get her the treatment she needed, and how he could make a real difference in her life. But as he glanced over at Sonia, her small face pale and fragile in the dim light of the limo, Johnny knew one thing for sure. He wasn't about to let her fight this battle alone. The promise he had made to her was just the beginning, and Johnny Depp was ready to do whatever it took to keep it. The search for answers. The limousine cruised through the city, a quiet hum filling the air as Johnny Depp sat across from Sonia, who remained oddly quiet. She had settled into the plush interior, her small body still tense, her eyes darting around as if expecting something or someone to jump out from the shadows. The contrast between her worn, frail form and the luxury of the car was stark. She looked so out of place in this world of polished glass and velvet seats. Johnny studied her quietly, noting the way her small fingers clutched the edge of the seat as if afraid to let go, even for a moment. He could tell she wasn't used to comfort. He had seen it before. When people were in survival mode for so long, comfort became something almost foreign. He wasn't sure what she'd been through, but he knew it hadn't been easy. After a few minutes of silence, Johnny decided to break the tension. He leaned forward slightly, his voice gentle. "You said you were trying to save up for medicine. Can you tell me more about that? What kind of medicine do you need?" Sonia hesitated, looking down at her lap, where her hands were now tightly clasped together. She took a deep breath before speaking, her voice barely above a whisper. "I have cancer," she said, her eyes welling up with tears. "Stage 3 malignant melanoma. The doctors, they said I need treatment, but I don't have the money. The orphanage, they can't help me. No one will help me." Johnny's heart sank. Cancer. The word seemed to hang in the air between them, thick with gravity. It was a word that carried so much weight, a word that so many people feared, and to hear it from a child, an innocent little girl who should have been worried about things like school or playing with friends, not fighting for her life, was almost too much to bear. Johnny sat back in his seat, his mind reeling. How had things gotten this bad? How had a young girl, no more than 10 or 11, ended up in such a situation? And why had the world allowed it to happen? He'd always believed in the importance of helping others, of lending a hand when someone was in need. But this felt different. It felt personal, like a call to action that he couldn't ignore. "Do you have anyone helping you, Sonia?" Johnny asked, trying to keep his voice steady despite the emotional storm brewing inside him. "Anyone who knows what's going on?" Sonia's eyes flickered with a moment of hesitation before she spoke, her voice small. "Miss Abigail. She's the one who takes care of us at the orphanage. She's been really kind, but we don't have enough money for the treatment. She's done everything she can, but it's just not enough." Sonia's voice trailed off, the weight of her words hanging heavily in the air. Johnny nodded, trying to digest what she had said. An orphanage, a kind caregiver, a lack of resources. It wasn't hard to imagine how this situation had spiraled out of control, especially in a world where resources were limited and children like Sonia were often forgotten. He could feel his anger building again, not at Sonia, not at Miss Abigail, but at the system that allowed these things to happen. A system that allowed children to suffer, to go unnoticed, to fight for their lives in silence. "Where is this orphanage?" Johnny asked, his voice calm but resolute. "I want to help. I'll do whatever I can." Sonia's eyes widened, a flicker of hope sparking in them. She wasn't used to this kind of attention. People rarely cared enough to do anything. She had learned to fend for herself, to ask for nothing, to trust no one. But Johnny was different. His kindness felt real. His words held weight, and for the first time in a long time, Sonia felt like she might actually be seen. "It's not far," Sonia said, her voice trembling slightly. "It's an old building on the edge of the city. It's small. Not many people know about it. Some of the kids have been there for a long time, but they don't always get the care they need." Johnny felt a pang in his chest as he listened. How many other children were out there like Sonia? How many had slipped through the cracks? How many were living in the shadows, struggling to survive, just like her? As the limousine continued its journey, Johnny's mind began to work in overdrive. He needed to do something about this, about Sonia's situation, about the orphanage, about all the children who were suffering in silence. He couldn't fix everything, but he could make a difference. He had the resources, the platform, and the will. And if that meant taking on an entire system, then so be it. "I'm going to help you, Sonia," Johnny said, his voice firm and reassuring. "I'm not going to let you fight this alone. And I'm going to make sure Miss Abigail and the orphanage get the help they need too." Sonia's eyes filled with tears, but she quickly wiped them away, as if ashamed of her own emotions. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you so much." Johnny smiled softly, his heart swelling with determination. "You don't have to thank me. I'm just doing what's right." The limousine finally slowed as it reached the outskirts of the city. The buildings here were older, smaller, and the streets less crowded. The hustle and bustle of downtown seemed a world away. Johnny's eyes scanned the area as they approached the location Sonia had described. He could see the crumbling facade of an old building in the distance, its windows boarded up, and a faded sign that read Hope's Haven Orphanage. The words on the sign seemed almost ironic now, knowing what he had just learned about the place. As the limousine pulled up to the curb, Johnny looked at Sonia one last time. She looked so small, so fragile. But in that moment, there was a spark of hope in her eyes. Hope that Johnny was going to help her make things right. Hope that she wasn't alone anymore. "Let's go inside," Johnny said, reaching out to gently take her hand. "We're going to fix this." The front door of the orphanage was old, the wood worn with age, and the brass handle tarnished. But as Johnny pushed the door open, a rush of warmth greeted them, both literal and figurative. Inside, the walls were lined with shelves of books and toys, and the faint smell of baking bread lingered in the air. It was clear that Miss Abigail had done everything she could to make the place feel like home for the children, but the lack of resources was evident. The building was old, and it felt like it was barely holding itself together. At the far end of the room, an elderly woman with silver hair pulled into a tight bun looked up from her desk. Her eyes softened when she saw Sonia, but when they landed on Johnny, her expression shifted to one of surprise and disbelief. She stood up quickly, her hands fluttering in nervous recognition. "Oh my goodness!" Miss Abigail exclaimed, her voice a mixture of shock and gratitude. You're Johnny Depp. What are you doing here?" Johnny smiled warmly, though his eyes were filled with a sense of urgency. "I'm here to help," he said simply. "I know about Sonia's situation, and I want to make sure she gets the treatment she needs. And I want to help you too, Miss Abigail. You've been doing all you can, but I can see that it's not enough. I'll make sure we get the resources you need to keep this place running properly." Tears welled up in Miss Abigail's eyes as she looked at Johnny, disbelief written across her face. "But how? We don't have the funds. We've been struggling for so long." "I'll take care of that," Johnny reassured her. "We'll make sure this place gets everything it needs, starting with Sonia. She's not going to fight this battle alone anymore. And neither are you." The weight of Johnny's words seemed to settle over the room. In that moment, the orphanage felt a little less forgotten, a little less alone. Johnny Depp wasn't just a celebrity walking through their doors. He was a man who cared, a man who was willing to make a difference. And in a world that so often overlooked the vulnerable, that made all the difference. Sonia looked up at him, her eyes filled with awe and gratitude, her voice barely a whisper as she said, Thank you. Thank you for believing in me. Johnny smiled down at her, his heart full of resolve. No need to thank me, sweetheart, he replied gently. You've always had the strength to fight. I'm just here to make sure you win. And with that, Johnny Depp made it his mission to change Sonia's life, and the lives of countless others just like her. A turning point. The air inside Hope's Haven orphanage felt warm and heavy, a stark contrast to the bustling, cold city outside. Johnny Depp stood in the center of the room, his eyes scanning the faces of the children who had gathered at the edges of the space. There was a mixture of curiosity and uncertainty in their eyes. They weren't used to seeing someone like Johnny here. The celebrity presence, though fleeting, had brought a new sense of purpose and hope to this place, a place that had long been forgotten by the world. Sonia, sitting quietly on the edge of a small sofa, her legs tucked underneath her, glanced up at Johnny with a shy smile. There was still a layer of fear in her eyes, but it had softened. She felt safer here, in the presence of Johnny's kindness. His promise to help her had been a lifeline in a sea of uncertainty, but it was more than just that. His presence symbolized a chance to finally be seen, to finally matter. Johnny's mind raced as he observed the small room. It was home to children who had faced unimaginable odds, orphans, runaways, and those caught in the margins of society. The walls, though decorated with colorful posters, showed signs of wear, and the furniture was mismatched, some pieces barely holding together. The orphanage had managed to provide the essentials, but it was clear that resources were stretched thin. Miss Abigail, who had been standing by, nervously adjusting her apron, stepped forward and cleared her throat. I know you must be wondering what exactly we need, Mr. Depp, she said, her voice trembling slightly. We've been doing our best, but it's never enough. The state of this place, the children's medical needs, the lack of funding, it's overwhelming. Johnny nodded, his gaze never wavering from her face. He had been in the entertainment industry long enough to understand the struggles many people face, but this was different. This wasn't just a charitable donation or a quick fix. This was about creating real, lasting change. He had made a promise to Sonia, but he had a feeling that this place and its children needed more than just his presence. We'll fix this, Johnny said, his voice calm but resolute. But we need a plan. We need to know exactly what you need and how we can help. Miss Abigail looked at him, her eyes wide with a mix of disbelief and hope. You'd really do that? You'd help us like this? Johnny smiled warmly, trying to ease her anxiety. I'm not going anywhere. I want to know what's needed to make this place a sanctuary for these children, not just a temporary solution. The elderly woman nodded, wiping away a tear that had formed at the corner of her eye. We need more medical support, she began. Sonia, as you know, is not the only one with serious health issues. Several children here have chronic illnesses, and we do our best to manage, but we can't afford the necessary treatments. And then there are the repairs. The building is in desperate need of maintenance. The plumbing's been faulty for months, and the roof leaks when it rains. Johnny was already making mental notes, the weight of her words sinking in. He looked around the orphanage again, seeing the small details that Miss Abigail had pointed out. The broken windows, the peeling paint, the neglected corners of the building. This place had been stretched to its limits, and yet it was clear that Miss Abigail and the staff had done everything they could to maintain a sense of family, a sense of love for the children. They had become more than caregivers. They had become a lifeline. All right, Johnny said, after a moment of thought. We'll start by getting the children the medical care they need. I'll personally reach out to my contacts in the healthcare industry. I can arrange for doctors, specialists, and treatment plans. But we'll need a team to help with the repairs here, too. I'll get in touch with some contractors. We'll start with the essentials, get the plumbing fixed, and then move to the roof. Miss Abigail looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. Mr. Depp, you don't know what this means to us. To these children. Johnny smiled gently. I do know, he said softly. You're doing more for these kids than anyone else would. It's time someone returned the favor." As he spoke, Sonia had slowly made her way over to Johnny, her small frame moving hesitantly. She had been watching him from a distance, her eyes filled with admiration but still tinged with the uncertainty of her past. She approached him slowly, almost as if she were testing the waters. When she was close enough, she hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Mr. Depp," Sonia began, her voice barely above a whisper, "why are you doing this for me? For all of us?" Johnny turned to her, his heart heavy with the weight of her question. Why indeed? He could have continued with his life, carrying on with his career, his responsibilities, but something about this situation, this little girl, had touched something deep within him. It wasn't just about helping one child. It was about showing the world that things could be different. That people, even in the darkest circumstances, deserved a chance at a better life. Sonia's eyes searched his face, her expression uncertain. Johnny crouched down to her level, his gaze soft but unwavering. "I'm doing this because you matter," Johnny said simply. "You all matter. And sometimes it takes someone from outside this world to show the world what's right in front of it." Sonia's eyes welled up with tears again, but this time they were tears of relief, not fear. Johnny didn't know if he would be able to fix everything, but he knew he had to try, and he would give everything he had to make it right. The sound of a knock on the door interrupted their conversation. Miss Abigail quickly walked over and opened it to reveal a tall man in a suit, holding a briefcase. His presence seemed out of place here in the orphanage, but Johnny recognized him immediately. "Mr. Depp?" the man asked, his voice professional but respectful. "I was informed you wanted to discuss potential funding and support for the orphanage." Johnny stood up, walking over to the man with a firm handshake. "Yes, that's right. Let's sit down and talk about how we can make this happen." As they settled at a table in the back of the room, Johnny quickly got to work. The conversation was straightforward. Johnny outlined what the orphanage needed and how he planned to coordinate with the right people to secure funding, medical care, and the necessary repairs. The man from the foundation took detailed notes, clearly impressed with Johnny's commitment. "We'll get the ball rolling as soon as possible," the man said, standing to leave. "We'll do everything we can to make sure the kids here get what they deserve." Johnny shook his hand again, then turned back to Miss Abigail and the children, who were watching him with a mix of awe and anticipation. "This is just the beginning," Johnny said to them, his voice steady with resolve. "But together, we're going to make sure you all have the care and the future you deserve." The children exchanged glances, some with wide eyes, others with tentative smiles. But for the first time in a long time, there was a sense of hope in the room. Johnny had made a promise, and he was going to keep it. As the day wore on and the details of their plans began to take shape, Johnny found himself quietly reflecting on the events that had led him here. It wasn't about being a celebrity. It wasn't about the photo shoots or the limelight. It was about doing what was right, and he knew that, despite the many obstacles that lay ahead, he had the power to change lives. Sonia's life, and the lives of the children at Hope's Haven, would be the first of many. Johnny had promised Sonia he wouldn't let her fight alone. And now, with the wheels of change set in motion, he knew there was no turning back. The journey had just begun. The unseen battle. The days following Johnny Depp's decision to help Sonia and the orphanage were a whirlwind. He had mobilized his resources quickly, using his vast network to reach out to medical professionals, contractors, and anyone who could assist with the much-needed renovations and medical treatment. But the journey was far from easy. There were countless hurdles to overcome, moments of doubt, and times when the situation felt too overwhelming to tackle alone. Yet Johnny had made a promise, and that promise was now at the center of his every thought. The orphanage, though small and struggling, had become a focal point of change. Miss Abigail, though hesitant at first, had opened up more and more as Johnny worked with her to organize donations and raise awareness. The community, initially skeptical, had slowly started to come around. The word of Johnny Depp's involvement had spread, and while many people had their doubts about celebrity charity, Johnny's actions spoke louder than any press release or tweet could. Johnny had also managed to arrange a team of doctors who came to the orphanage to assess the children's health. What they found was heartbreaking. Several of the children, like Sonia, were suffering from serious medical conditions. Some of them had been undiagnosed due to a lack of resources. The orphanage's medical budget was non-existent, and the few treatments the children had received were minimal and largely ineffective. But now, with the help of Johnny's connections, the children had access to the best care possible. Still, even as progress was made, Johnny could sense the weight of the situation pressing down on him. There were still moments of doubt, when he wondered if he could truly make a difference in the face of such overwhelming adversity. But every time he looked into Sonia's eyes, those eyes filled with fear, hope, and a quiet determination, he was reminded of why he was doing this. It wasn't just about fixing a building or raising funds. It was about changing lives. And it was about ensuring that no one, especially a child like Sonia, had to face their battles alone. One late afternoon, Johnny found himself sitting in a small office at the orphanage, his hands folded on the desk in front of him. Miss Abigail had gone home for the day, leaving Johnny to take stock of the progress they'd made. He had just spoken with the contractor about the repairs that were underway, and while the roof was finally being patched up, there was still so much more to do. The plumbing was only half fixed, and there were still cracks in the walls, doors that didn't close properly, and broken windows that had yet to be replaced. But they were getting there, slowly but surely. Johnny leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes, his thoughts drifting. He hadn't been to the orphanage for a few days, having been caught up in meetings and phone calls. But now that he had a moment to breathe, he couldn't help but think about how far they had come, and how much more needed to be done. Sonia's condition was still a major concern. The doctors had started her treatment plan, but her cancer was aggressive, and the chances of remission were still uncertain. Every day felt like a battle, one that she couldn't win alone. Suddenly, the sound of the door opening broke Johnny from his thoughts. He looked up to see Miss Abigail standing in the doorway, her face lined with concern. "Mr. Depp," she said, her voice soft, "I need to speak with you. It's about Sonia." Johnny's heart skipped a beat. "What's happened?" he asked, his voice tight with worry. Miss Abigail's expression softened, but there was a sadness in her eyes. "Sonia's condition has worsened," she explained. "She's been having trouble breathing, and her energy is just draining. The doctors are doing what they can, but the treatment isn't working as quickly as they hoped." Johnny stood up, his chair scraping against the floor as he made his way toward Miss Abigail. His thoughts raced. What could he do? How could he help? He had promised her, promised all of them, that they wouldn't face this battle alone. But this was different. Cancer didn't wait for promises. It didn't care who you were or how hard you fought. "I need to see her," Johnny said, his voice low, determined. "Where is she?" Miss Abigail led him down the narrow hallway to a small room at the back of the orphanage. The room was cozy, if not a little sparse, just a single bed, a dresser, and a chair by the window. Sonia was lying in the bed, her small body barely visible beneath the thick covers. Her head was slightly propped up by a pillow, but she still looked fragile, her pale skin almost translucent in the soft glow of the lamplight. When Johnny entered the room, Sonia's eyes flickered open. She smiled weakly when she saw him, her face lighting up with a mixture of gratitude and exhaustion. Johnny sat down beside her bed, his heart breaking at the sight of her. She was so small, so fragile, yet there was a fire in her eyes that refused to go out. "Hey, Sonia," Johnny said gently, reaching out to take her hand. "How are you feeling?" Sonia gave a small shrug, her voice barely above a whisper. "Tired," she said simply. "But I'm okay. I know you're trying to help." Johnny squeezed her hand, his heart heavy. "We are helping. We're going to make sure you get all the treatment you need, and we're going to make sure you get the life you deserve." Sonia smiled faintly, but Johnny could see the sadness in her eyes. "I don't want to be a burden," she whispered, her voice shaky. "I know you're trying your best, but I don't think I can fight this anymore." Johnny leaned closer, his face soft but intense. "Sonia, listen to me. You're not a burden. Not to me, not to anyone here. And you're not going to give up. We're in this together, all right?" Sonia nodded slowly, tears welling up in her eyes. Johnny gently wiped them away with his thumb, trying to hold back his own. He had seen the pain in her eyes, felt the weight of her fear, but he couldn't let her give up. He couldn't let her believe that she had no future. Not while he was here. "Promise me you'll keep fighting," Johnny said, his voice strong, even though his heart was breaking inside. "Promise me you'll keep going." Sonia hesitated for a moment, and then with a small but brave smile, she nodded. "I'll try." Johnny stood up, his resolve solidifying. There was no time to waste. Sonia needed more than just treatment. She needed a chance, a real chance at life, and he was going to do whatever it took to make sure she got that. "I'm going to take care of this," Johnny said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. "We'll get you what you need, Sonia. I promise." As he left her room, Johnny felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. There was so much to do, so many obstacles to overcome. But there was one thing he knew for sure. He wasn't going to stop until Sonia had the chance she deserved. The battle wasn't just hers anymore. It was his too, and he wasn't going to lose. The next few days were a blur of phone calls, meetings, and relentless action. Johnny's network, his resources, were all dedicated to one cause: saving Sonia, and by extension, all the children of Hope's Haven. But as much as he was pushing forward, Johnny knew that time was slipping away. Sonia's health continued to deteriorate, and the feeling of helplessness crept in like an unwanted shadow. But even in the face of that fear, Johnny never wavered. He had made a promise, and he would keep it, no matter the cost. But deep down, Johnny knew that he couldn't do it alone. He was only one man. It was time for the community, the world, to step up. This wasn't just Sonia's fight. It was the fight of every child who had ever been overlooked, abandoned, or ignored. And Johnny wasn't going to stop until that fight was won. As the days passed, Johnny pushed forward, and a sense of hope began to take root in Hope's Haven. Change was coming, and Sonia, despite her fragile condition, had become the spark that ignited something bigger than herself. Johnny wasn't just changing her life. He was changing the lives of every child in that orphanage. And with every step, he knew that he was fighting for something greater than himself. The ripple effect. The morning sun streamed through the small, cracked windows of Hope's Haven orphanage, casting a soft glow over the worn, but now bustling, space. The air was charged with a new energy, an unspoken promise that change was not just a distant dream, but a real and tangible force. The repairs were well underway, and the children had begun to receive medical care that, just a few weeks ago, had seemed impossible. Johnny Depp had kept his word, but the transformation unfolding at the orphanage wasn't just the result of his actions alone. It had become a movement, a ripple of change that was beginning to spread far beyond the orphanage's walls. Johnny had done everything in his power to help Sonia and the other children. Through his connections, he had secured funding, medical assistance, and volunteers. He had put his heart and soul into the cause, but even with all the progress, there was still an underlying tension, a sense that there was more work to be done. He knew that while the orphanage had come a long way, the real challenge was going to be sustaining the changes, ensuring that this wasn't just a temporary fix, but a long-term solution. But he was determined. He wouldn't stop until Sonia and the others had the life they deserved. Over the past few days, Johnny had spent a significant amount of time at the orphanage, coordinating efforts and meeting with people who could provide additional support. He'd even spoken with a prominent local news outlet, hoping that media attention would bring in more donations and help spread the word about Hope's Haven's mission. However, in the back of his mind, there was always one question that gnawed at him. Was this enough? Johnny had already taken care of Sonia's immediate medical needs. Her cancer treatment had begun, and the doctors were cautiously optimistic. But Johnny knew that there were other children in this orphanage who had been living in similar conditions for years. What would happen to them when the media attention faded? What would happen when the public turned its gaze elsewhere? Miss Abigail, the orphanage's caregiver, had become an ally in every sense of the word. She had worked tirelessly with Johnny, managing the daily operations of the orphanage, while also helping to implement the changes he had brought. Despite her growing weariness, she never complained. Her passion for the children, her unwavering belief in them, was the driving force behind everything that had been accomplished. But even she was beginning to show signs of exhaustion. Johnny knew that Miss Abigail couldn't carry this weight alone forever. One afternoon, as Johnny sat in the small, makeshift office at the orphanage, he was deep in thought, staring at a list of upcoming tasks and goals. A soft knock on the door pulled him out of his thoughts. Miss Abigail entered, her face tired but her eyes still holding the same fierce determination Johnny had come to admire. "Mr. Depp," she said quietly, sitting down across from him, "there's something we need to discuss." Johnny nodded, gesturing for her to continue. "What's on your mind, Miss Abigail?" She sighed deeply, looking down at her hands for a moment before meeting his gaze. "I've been thinking a lot about the future of this place. We've made great strides, yes, but I'm concerned about what happens next. I'm getting older, Mr. Depp, and I can't run this place forever. There's only so much I can do on my own." Johnny leaned forward, his brow furrowing slightly. "I understand, Miss Abigail. This place is special, and I can't imagine it functioning without you. But I won't let it fall apart. I'll make sure that this continues long after I'm gone. These children need stability, and I'll make sure they have it." She nodded, her eyes brimming with emotion. "You've already done so much, Mr. Depp. I don't know where we would be without you. But I'm not just talking about me. I'm talking about the children. They need more than just a roof over their heads. They need mentors. They need role models, people who can teach them how to build a future for themselves." Johnny sat back, his mind racing. Miss Abigail was right. The orphanage was no longer just a place to house kids. It was a place where futures were being shaped. These children weren't just looking for food and shelter. They were looking for hope, for guidance, for someone to believe in them. And Johnny knew he had the power to bring that belief to life. "What are you suggesting?" Johnny asked, his voice steady but filled with curiosity. "I think we need to bring in more people. People who can teach the children skills they can use when they leave here. Volunteers who can help with tutoring, with job readiness programs, maybe even partnerships with local businesses that could offer internships or apprenticeships. We need a community of support that will carry them through adulthood." Johnny's eyes lit up. "That's a brilliant idea. We need to create an ecosystem, a support system that can help these kids not just survive, but thrive." The more Johnny thought about it, the more he realized that Miss Abigail had hit on something crucial. It wasn't just about making sure they had medical care or fixing a broken roof. It was about preparing these children for life beyond the orphanage. It was about ensuring they had the tools, the skills, and the support to build a better future for themselves. "I'll make some calls," Johnny said, a sense of determination settling over him. "We'll bring in experts, professionals who can help with education, career development, and emotional support. I'll speak with some people I know in the business world. We'll get this place the recognition and resources it deserves." The conversation shifted then, and Johnny and Miss Abigail discussed the logistics of bringing in new programs, identifying partners who could provide training, and creating a long-term plan for Hope's Haven to sustain itself. They agreed that the immediate priority was to ensure that Sonia and the other children received the necessary care and attention, but it was equally important to start laying the groundwork for the future. The orphanage needed to be a place of empowerment, not just a temporary refuge. As the days turned into weeks, Johnny worked tirelessly to put these plans into action. He reached out to schools, local businesses, and nonprofit organizations, connecting them with the orphanage's mission. Slowly, the changes began to snowball. People who had once been indifferent to the struggles of children like Sonia were now stepping forward, eager to contribute. It was a reminder to Johnny of the power of community and the ripple effect that one act of kindness could have. But the road was not without its challenges. There were setbacks, financial struggles, and moments when Johnny questioned whether he was truly making a difference. One day, as he sat with Miss Abigail in the orphanage's common area, he voiced his concerns. "I'm not sure this is enough," Johnny confessed, his voice tinged with doubt. "I feel like we're just scratching the surface. I want to do more, but I don't know if it's possible." Miss Abigail placed a gentle hand on his arm, her touch reassuring. "What you've already done, Mr. Depp, is more than enough. These children have hope now. They have a chance at a future. You've given them that, and that's priceless." Johnny looked around at the children playing and interacting with the new tutors, their faces brighter than he had ever seen them. And for the first time in a long time, he realized that Miss Abigail was right. This wasn't just about numbers or grand gestures. It was about the people in front of him, the children, the caregivers, the volunteers, who were all working together to create a better future. Johnny leaned back in his chair, a sense of peace washing over him. The journey wasn't over, and there was still much to be done. But the foundation had been laid, and the ripple effect of their actions was spreading. Sonia, the girl who had once been abandoned, now had a future that she and the other children at Hope's Haven could build together. And as Johnny looked out the window, watching the sun set over the city, he knew one thing for sure: the promise he had made to Sonia, to all of them, was one he would keep. Because sometimes the most important battles weren't the ones fought in the spotlight, but the quiet ones, fought in the hearts of those who refused to give up. The ripple of change was just beginning, and Johnny Depp was determined to see it through.